Hello there. Welcome to the symposium on Proposition 22, sponsored by the USC Price School of Public Policy. I'm an economist at University of California, Irvine, and I've worked a lot on urban economics and transportation. So it's a pleasure to be here and to be involved in this symposium. Let me give you some brief background before I introduce our two main speakers. Since their foundation, the companies Uber and Lyft treated their drivers as independent contractors. So they were not treated as employees in the usual way, but rather as independent contractors. And this treatment seemed to make sense because the drivers had a lot of flexibility in arranging their hours and the routes they traveled. But in 2019, Sacramento passed a law requiring that Uber and Lyft drivers and other members of the gig economy be treated as employees, not as independent contractors. So this kind of treatment, which involves various benefits that contractors do not get, according to one study, would raise the compensation per driver by 30%, hence raise the cost to the companies by 30%. So Proposition 22 was put on the ballot in response to Sacramento's law. And what Proposition 22 would do would be to overturn the law, but to take a few steps to raise compensation for Uber and Lyft drivers. I should say that it would overturn the law just for these two companies, not for other gig operations. So the question is, what should voters do? Should they vote yes or no on Proposition 22? A yes vote is a vote for the status quo modified by these increases in compensation that are spelled out in the proposition. So if you vote yes, if you like the status quo with Uber and Lyft drivers treated as independent contractors. A no vote is a vote to uphold the law and to treat drivers as employees, not as independent contractors. So this is a very controversial proposition, and it is the most expensive proposition in the history of the proposition system in California, with over $200 million spent by the proponents of Proposition 22. The average voter is not really all that well equipped to decide this. So the purpose of this symposium is to bring more information to you, the participants here, to help you understand what's going on and to decide what your own position ought to be. And so we have two experts here to help you. The first is Jim Moore. Jim is an engineering professor at USC and a transportation expert. He also has a joint appointment in the Price School of Public Policy, our host. Zakhary Mallett is a PhD candidate in the Price School of Public Policy, specializing in urban planning and development. And he was a former governing board member of the San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit District. Now, I think it's appropriate for Zakhary to go first, because he's the one who's against the proposition, namely in favor of the Sacramento law that requires Uber and Lyft drivers to be employees. And then Jim, who's taking the yes side on the proposition, will follow up with his response. And afterwards, we will have questions, a few questions from me to get the ball rolling, and then questions from the audience. So, Zakhary, take it away.
Well, thank you, Jan, for that intro, and thank you to the Price School for setting this up and hosting this. I would encourage a no vote. I am taking a no vote on Proposition 22. For starters, Mr. Brueckner topped this off by saying that it made sense to classify workers as independent contractors when these companies got started. I would vehemently disagree with that. That is how the companies sold their model. But the reality, and I'm going to briefly share my screen here to highlight this, while most Uber and Lyft drivers work few hours on the platforms and very few work full time, the reality is that those full timers do a lion's share of the work. They account for about 47% of the total labor hours provided on the platform. In another study by the Economic Policy Institute, they also complete about half of the trips. So while there are many who do a little of the work on the platform, there are these select few who are the core of the platform's success and do the lion's share of the work. The purpose of this employee versus contractor distinction is that an employee is core to the business and the business cannot survive without the employee. A contractor is a sideline worker who you're hired to do a side job, and that is not the case with Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, and delivery drivers. Furthermore, they do not have the independence to amend their rates, the rules of engagement on the platform, etc. They are at the discretion of Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, etc. That makes them employees. So they're being cheated by this misclassification. But I would argue it goes well beyond this employee and contractor debate. But how these companies exist and operate is by having a saturated supply of drivers who are available but not utilized. About 30% of the time that drivers are out there, they are on standby and they are not compensated for being available while on standby. That currently is a cost that is paid by the workers because they have to bear the loss of those hours. It also allows streets to be highly trafficked because the cost of providing that service is not internalized to the company. It also allows the company to evade liability costs, cost of medical coverage, among other things that ultimately fall on the public to provide. Reclassifying drivers as employees, which the law says they are, would internalize these costs, allow supply to be scaled to demand rather than oversupplied, and internalize these costs of insurance, liability, and otherwise that are right now being passed onto the public. And that's why I vote no on 22.
Okay, so let's turn to Jim Moore for rebuttal.
All right, thanks very much. Thank you, Jan. Thanks, Zakhary. I appreciate it. All right, so the body of law that draws a distinction between independent contractors and employees has longstanding. It's not a recent sort of distinction. It exists in English common law, and it's changed incrementally over time, as the law does. Up until '89 and the Obrello case, there was, I don't want to call it a test, but the way the law had evolved, there was an 11-point standard that the court could refer to decide in a given circumstance whether a relationship was that of independent contractor or employee. And the most important element there was control over the work. There were multiple other highly relevant elements, one of which is the ability to release someone from employment without cause, and several others, whether or not the individual owned their own tools, the level of skill involved in executing the work, how the individual was paid. So it was a very sort of refined set of considerations that had come up through precedent. Then in 2018, in the Dynamex case, the California Supreme Court, for a fairly narrow reason, came up with the set of conditions that Zakhary has referred to without labeling the ABC test, but I think that's what he was referring to. And there were three, and really compared to the body of law that existed prior to that ruling, I think is something of a blunt instrument. And it's somewhat telling that the court applied it in a very narrow way. The court was trying to determine whether or not a group of individuals were due back wages, but hadn't applied it to the general public policy context of who's an employee and who's an independent contractor. It was even at that level of application, I still think it was an exercise in overreach. It was really a form of judicial legislation. And the judiciary ought not be in the business of legislation. The judiciary ought to be in the business of interpreting what legislators have decided the law ought to be. And I think the state legislature provides evidence that this was in fact what was happening, because it was that ruling that became part and parcel, effectively AB 5 in 2019. So it's still a blunt instrument. And since 2019, there are a number of different players, economic entities, some firms, some groups who have applied for exceptions to AB 5. Basically, people who were typically involved in freelance work could only compete in their own markets if they had the freedom that went with being an independent contractor. And we're going to be shut out of business entirely because the people who would otherwise have to become their employees, or employers, pardon me, weren't going to be able to afford them if they had to become responsible for them as employees and provide the full slate of benefits employees are due. So that meant these folks, these freelancers, writers, artists, musicians, were going to have to get out of the business of what they were doing unless an exception was carved out for this group. And what we see is something very similar happening here. The ABC test says, A, what's most important is control, but it's no longer a refined definition of control the way it was prior to Abrello. It is just binary, it's control, and there's no real clarity on what degree of control is involved here. There's the requirement that the individual be doing work, the contractor be doing work that is not typically the work of the entity with whom the contract has been formed, separate from what the firm would do. And then the third test is whether or not the contractor is part of a defined profession. So AB 5 really turned the trajectory of law on its head by making everyone by default an employee, unless they and the person who would otherwise be their employer could demonstrate that they were not employees, but in fact met this test and were independent contractors. And it was a very heavy-handed approach that I don't think adequately accounts for the way work is configured at the boundary between the two conditions the test is intended to differentiate between. Now, all of that is really backstory. What's really important here, more than anything else, is that the proponents of Prop 22, forgive me, yes and no, it got me confused. The folks who argue that AB 5 should stand and that Prop 22 should get a no, right, are arguing really effectively that the benefits of trade can be transferred from the likes of Lyft and Uber and DoorDash and these other various entities to the drivers. And that's really very simple-minded, because if the cost of doing business goes up, less business is done. The price at which firms will offer goods and services, if that price goes up, if those costs go up, the price at which those goods and services can be offered must necessarily go up. Now, granted, cost doesn't set price, supply and demand set price, but total cost is a floor. Marginal cost is a floor on the rate at which providers are prepared to provide goods and services. And if that marginal cost goes up, then we're going to see many circumstances where services would otherwise be provided at a given price, where the services will not be available because it won't be profitable. And in that case, benefits are being transferred from not the operators, not the service providers here, but rather from the consumer. So the consumer stands to be hurt by a no vote on Prop 22, and the consumer will be helped. Lyft and Uber and DoorDash and these other various players stand to be hurt. And 80% of the folks who are currently operating what I still think of as jitney services, who are driving for Lyft and Uber, stand to be hurt because they would prefer to remain independent contractors. Granted, they don't provide the majority of the service that is delivered in this mode, but they still benefit very substantially, a large number of them, from the services they're in a position to provide. And they can only participate because they have the freedom to work their own schedule. This pricing aspect where the platform provider, Uber and Lyft, are in the position to set prices, I would have to agree, probably does exhibit a degree of control that would cause Uber and Lyft to fail the ABC test that came out of Dynamex and then was codified by the state legislature. But that just means that the law is wrong. The law should change. And that's exactly what Prop 22 is intended to do. So this is a minor modification in the law that moves the boundary for specific classes of activity, of work, from the position that defines who is an independent contractor and who is an employee in a way that benefits the largest number of people. So I'm in favor of improving social welfare wherever possible. That means increasing consumer surplus, increasing producer surplus, diminishing administrative cost. And Prop 22 does all of that. So I'll be voting yes.
Thank you, Jim. Let me just flesh out a little bit some of the things that have been said and also then pose a couple of questions. So first of all, the complaints are that Uber and Lyft drivers get a mileage rate that is too low, an expense rate that is too low for the miles that they drive. They get an hourly rate that is too low for the time spent driving. And they lack other benefits like any contribution toward health insurance. So making them employees would raise all of this stuff. Proposition 22 goes halfway. It raises the mileage rate a bit. It raises the hourly rate for engaged time a bit, but it doesn't go as far as would happen if the drivers were employees. Proposition 22 also gives a health insurance subsidy, but doesn't really totally pay for health insurance. Okay, so those are some of the details, but let me just step back and say that Uber and Lyft have revolutionized local transportation in California and elsewhere in the world by providing trips that are very cheap and they're easy to arrange online. So it's been a revolutionary change in the way people get around. If the drivers were made employees, the costs of providing this service would rise, as Jim said. Well, Uber and Lyft are now losing money. They've been losing money for a long time. And higher costs would force them to raise prices. Prices would have to go up. They probably need to go up anyway because of the losses that the companies have been making. But prices would go up. And so this really cheap mode of transportation that everybody loves would become more expensive. And so economics would tell us that when the price goes up, people are going to use less of it. And so there'll be fewer trips made by Uber and Lyft if the drivers are treated as employees. And as a result, trip volumes will go down. I mean, that's supply and demand, lower trip volumes and less employment for drivers. There won't be as many drivers needed because the cost of a trip will be higher and people will want fewer trips. So let me say that I'm sympathetic to the issues here, the problems of Uber and Lyft drivers. Don't get me wrong, I'm sympathetic to their situation. But in a sense, what treating the drivers as employees would do is it would sort of knock out the supports from under this this revolutionary system and make it more expensive and less appealing. And so you could argue that this is just another example of what people call the business unfriendly regulatory environment of California that makes it hard to for many companies to operate and to provide services and goods in a cost efficient way. So I think that's a question. Do we want to go in that direction of sort of undermining or harming this this revolutionary system of transportation? Well, maybe yes, because the revolutionary cheap system of transportation has been built on the backs of workers who are underpaid. So, you could argue that yes, that we're providing these services at too low a price because the costs are artificially depressed via exploitation, in quotes, of the workers. So that's not an unreasonable point of view. But I think that you have to come to grips with this question. Secondly, I think I would like to ask both the speakers, what about the fact that being an Uber and Lyft driver is really popular? People love to do it. There's a huge supply of workers for these companies. Nobody's dragging these drivers to work with a gun at their head. They're voluntarily doing the work. Now, you could argue that, the people in sweatshops in the 19th century were voluntarily doing the work too, so that doesn't prove anything. People are destitute, they need the money, so they're going to do work even though they're underpaid. So those are a few things that I wanted to throw out. And the speakers might want to respond or embellish or whatever.
Sure. So you classified Uber, Lyft, et cetera, as revolutionary. And I would say only half so. They're revolutionary only in as much as they have created apps and used internet and communications technology to more efficiently link available drivers to available riders. However, their employment model is not at all revolutionary. They rely, and you mentioned the economics. The economics are highly distorted. They rely on two sources to subsidize and make these services so cheap. One is bottomless venture capital that their competitors do not have access to. They do not use venture capital for innovation purposes. They use it to subsidize operations. And the other is the backs of the workers. This is not an economically efficient system. If I set up a pizza parlor shop next to Jim's Pizza and I have bottomless venture capital so that I can sell my pies at $5 a piece rather than $20 a piece, Jim is going to go out of business before I do. In addition, if I can use an app to link an available server to a table rather than keeping them hired during their standby periods while demand is low, I'm going to save on my cost, but it will be at Jim's expense. Again, this misclassification is the foundation, but the impacts are much broader. We have seen rental car companies, private parking lot shuttle companies, all these systems that do not rely on expense pass-throughs and venture capital have to go out of business, despite the fact that that venture capital is not bottomless, making Uber's and Lyft's future dubious at best. So I don't believe that it's sustainable or appropriate to allow companies to work off of the backs of their workers. Some base pay is necessary. I also want to reiterate that 30% of the time spent on these platforms is standby time. And that standby time is needless traffic on our roads, which is a public cost. By internalizing that and making them employees, the companies will have to scale supply to match demand. That is the economically efficient response. They will be responsible for liability if drivers do anything inappropriate. Right now, drivers are fully liable for that, which can happen in the criminal court system, but they don't have the capital to pay the costs of liability. That will be transferred to the companies now. I don't see this as net negative. I see it as net positive. It creates an even working field for the broader economy and protects the public and the workforce from bearing costs that are traditionally an employer cost.
Interesting. Well, liability is at the core of the question of historically has been at the core of the question of who's an independent contractor and who's an employee. The question became important because of the liability associated with the actions of individuals and whether or not liability was shared with employers or whether they were entirely incident to an individual, whether that liability was incident to an individual. This Prop 22 points to an interesting outcome here. So Uber and Lyft are not the only companies or industries to head to the state legislature and look for an exception. They're just the only one that's been really unsuccessful. And the question is why? And I think the answer is the influence of organized labor and the state legislature. I think that labor sees an opportunity here to organize a group of employees who aren't yet classified as employees and can't be organized as such unless they are so classified. And the legislature was largely beholden to labor and as a result has accommodated them. Again, we're back to the argument, can a fixed level of benefits be transferred from one group to another? And we aren't really helping independent operators turn into employees if there are no jobs for them. We haven't provided them with additional opportunity. We have diminished options available for consumers. We have diminished options available for the producers and the deliverers of these services. I don't want to resort to technicality here. Are Uber and Lyft transportation companies? Are they something else? The closer I look at their operations, the more I conclude that they are matching demand for transportation to supply for transportation, but they're providing demanders for the service with information about the supply, and they're providing suppliers with information about the demand. But they're really in the information business. But that's really a technicality, because in terms of the control being exerted, they do probably fail the ABC test. But the ABC test is wrong-headed. It should not be codified in law. If it were up to me, I mean, if I were king, I would do away with AB5 entirely. But I'll take incremental improvements where I can find them. If we're unhappy with the externalities associated with travel, let's internalize them as intelligently as possible. If we think there's too much congestion, let's rely on congestion charges. We're going to need alternative revenues for financing road supply in any event if we want to stop burning fossil fuels. You can't collect gas taxes on gas you're not burning, right? So we do need an alternative financing mechanism. And frankly, venture capital is venturing, right? Venture capital is there being expended, not because there's a gun to anybody's head, but because the people who own the capital hope ultimately to turn some coin. It's not inexhaustible. It's meant to try to establish a market for transportation that we didn't previously allow to exist that is probably very profitable. And the fact that it didn't exist is our fault. I agree with Zakhary that there's only half a revolution here. We could have harvested the benefits of these new enterprises fairly easily just by deregulating taxi companies. And we should deregulate taxi companies tomorrow and level the playing field so that they can compete more effectively. And regulations are very important. We can get them wrong. The airport van industry is a good example. Prior to the days in which it was controlled by the PUC, there was a burst of economic activity in that sector. You got off the plane at SFO or LAX, and there were all these owner-operators vying for your business. And I argue that the traveling public got a good deal because they got a low-cost service. The people who were there using their time and capital to provide the service were getting a good deal. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. They'd be off doing something else. And calls for further organization at airports were mounted to avoid traveler confusion, and all those calls came from the largest operators in that sector, the prime times and the super shuttles, who were being strictly outcompeted by the mom and pop operations. And once we began to regulate that industry, activity dropped off. And everybody suffered. The people who were providing the service and making money suffered. The people who were consuming the services cheaply suffered. The only people who benefited were Primetime and Super Show and whatever legislators they had made campaign contributions. Right? So it's possible for us to take regulatory steps that really do a lot of economic damage. And Prop 22 is an opportunity to take a regulatory step to improve our efforts to date in a way that will produce a lot of benefits, because every time a transaction occurs, both sides of that transaction are better off. Everybody is a volunteer. There are no losers in voluntary transactions, right? So we should be adopting rules that enable as many of those transactions as possible, not burdening them, not coming up with arbitrary definitions that force folks that want to engage in those transactions out of the market. I'll stop prattling there.
And respectfully, Jim, if I may respond briefly, this concept of control has existed even before dynamics. That existed under the Borello test. And to be a true independent contractor, to have an open taxi market, as you suggest, the companies would need to be many arm's length away from their drivers, and they are not. They dictate the price, they dictate the rules of engagement, they artificially influence where and when they work through these bonus structures. They have too many hands on the drivers for the drivers to be true independent contractors. I think if they just provided a technology service, we probably wouldn't be having this discussion today.
Let's switch from to questions from the audience. Let me read, we have 4 of them. First one is directed to Jim Moore, and it's from Hugo. Hugo says, you mentioned DoorDash, a food delivery platform. My understanding is that Proposition 22 does not cover food delivery, but deals only with driving.
My understanding is different, but I've been wrong before. Certainly, DoorDash has been a major contributor to the campaign in favor of Prop 22. So I think they feel an economic stake.
Okay. So second question is from David Belson. And the question sort of relates to some of the things we've been talking about here. He says, it seems like the public benefits from low-cost transportation and the drivers benefit from available part-time work. Sorry, it seems like the public benefits from low-cost transportation and the drivers benefit from available part-time work. Also, idle resources, cars, are used. Is there any middle way where some of the public benefits can be transferred to the drivers?
Well, I think Prop 22 as written does provide some middle ground. I think that I'm not a big fan of interfering with other parties' opportunities to transact. As long as everybody involved in a transaction is a volunteer and any externalities associated with the transaction are reasonably controlled, I'm prepared to let the market guide it rather than having the legislature step in. Because I don't know what the legislature should do.
Okay, here's another question that sort of relates to this point. This is from Victoria de Guzman. She says, perhaps more succinctly, are we exploiting desperate drivers to fulfill our desire for rides, and do we care? How would this compare to a minimum wage argument? So extending that point, you could argue that the minimum wage is a government-imposed restriction on labor markets. So the government is intervening in the free market there. So maybe this kind of intervention is okay too. That would be the conclusion to draw from her question.
So I do believe that this is a form of exploiting labor. Basically, a high share of Uber drivers are certainly lower income and immigrant populations and low skill workers who get lured into the easy access of entry and invest in that. Now, for this full-time core of workers who do the lion's share of the work, they're disproportionately burdened. And I guess the best parallel I can give you, because it boils down to this control element. A plumber who goes into the plumbing market and originally charges just $25, when he or she realizes that that does not cover their costs, they can increase their price in order to cover their costs. Uber and Lyft drivers do not have the ability to do that. They are locked into whatever rate the company sets. And so when you're already vested, when you got a new car, have put a ton of miles on it, and are vested in that and cannot easily switch to something else because you have to still pay your bills, that is a burden to not be able to change your own rate. And that's why they are not independent contractors, and why this is exploitation of labor.
But a lot of Uber cars are just the person's personal vehicle. They're not brand new cars that were bought.
That is for that.
So in response to your point, the argument is if the pay is too low, don't do it. Don't be an Uber driver.
That's easy said for that. And that indeed happens. Greater than 50% of Uber drivers terminate their work within 1 year. But what I am focused on is that core set who stay on board and commit over 30 hours per week and do the lion's share of the work. The reason they do that, and that's 40,000 miles per year easily. I was doing it for a period. And when you invest that much, it is hard to separate out of that. You don't have time to do so, because to make ends meet on such low pay per trip and per minute, you have to keep going. And that is the reality for those workers who are the core of the business.
Okay, here's another question. Zakhary shared a data point that showed a small percentage of drivers perform a majority of the work, but work was defined as hours, not rides. Do we have data on how many rides are performed by full-time versus part-time drivers?
Yes, I can refer you to an Economic Policy Institute report. I might send this to staff who can add it to a link. About 50% of the trips on the platform are completed by drivers who commit 35 hours or more to the platform.
Okay. Next question. That was an anonymous question, the one I just read. The next question is by James Maddox. What is the downside of approving Proposition 22? Conversely, what is the benefit of approving Proposition 22? Well, I think that we've kind of covered this pretty much. Does anybody want to say anything further?
One of the most important things I learned from my mother is that two wrongs don't make a right. And minimum wage laws are a bad idea. The fact that they exist doesn't make interfering in this market a good idea. Minimum wage laws just make it illegal to be unproductive. And if you can't be sufficiently productive that your work covers the cost of hiring you, you're not allowed to work. And that doesn't seem very fair-minded to me.
There's another question here. There's another anonymous question about taxis, but let me just combine that question with the next one.
Could I briefly answer the question you asked but wasn't answered?
Okay, go ahead.
So overall, we've discussed the ups and the downs of Proposition 22. I guess what I would say is a further down, and what certainly labor is concerned about, is that this is the most expensive proposition in history. And if this passes, it will send a signal to the broader business community that they can buy their way out of law and buy laws to their benefit. And that is a concern that has been voiced out there. But much of the rest, I agree, has been covered in our back and forth.
Okay, thank you.
Still going to vote. Nobody's paying for our votes. Right? We're going to go to the ballot and we're going to decide. Right? Nobody's paying me to decide.
Okay, here's the next question by Michael DiSano. He says, Taxi Magic existed before Uber and Lyft, which provided the service Uber does with taxis. It failed for many reasons. Uber's service is better from a driver like myself and user. Taxi drivers have left taxis and joined Uber. Please explain how Uber and Lyft could be bad. I guess that's a question for you, Zakhary.
So I'll reiterate that they are bad because they are economically unsustainable and are leaving damage behind for whatever lifetime they exist. They depend on labor exploitation and venture capital to exist. If either of those are removed from the equation, they could not exist. And you would be returning back to the success, as mediocre as it may be, of taxis, shuttles, etc. I do not consider, I'll refer back to that pizza parlor competition analogy because I feel that is an accurate analogy. I don't consider converting my employees to contractors and using an app to dispatch them to a table and not paying them while they're waiting on a table and using venture capital to get my exotic ingredients from Italy so that I can sell pies for $5 a pie while Jim next door still has to charge $25. I don't consider that innovative. I consider that cheating. And AB5 is helping solidify one element of the cheating, the labor exploitation element. There's still work to be done on antitrust law to mitigate using venture capital to subsidize operations.
Last question from the floor is, what is the 7/8 legislative vote that I heard about that is tied to Proposition 22?
That's a very weird thing. It's gotten a lot of media attention and it deserves it. And I think it's probably a political mistake by the folks who formulated Prop 22. It builds in a requirement that says this exemption cannot be overridden by the legislature without a 7/8 vote. I don't know of any other legislative activity that requires a 7/8 vote. I think it's heavy-handed and it's bad optics, and I think the folks who drafted the proposition probably hurt themselves by inserting it.
I would dither that.
We're about at the end of our allotted time here. I want to thank both the speakers for their thoughts and thank the USC Price School for hosting this event. And I hope the discussion that you all have heard will help you decide how to vote on Proposition 22. In a couple of weeks, we'll find out the answer. We'll find out whether Uber and Lyft drivers are going to be employees or whether they're going to be independent contractors paid a little bit better than they are now. So have a good day, everyone.
Thank you both.
Thank you.